This is the oval ball polystyrene drawing project. It's the only polystyrene drawing project I completed during the month of July 2025. Though I recall starting this project about a year ago, though I only did so with the intention of using that project to reorganize my marker satchel at the time. And throughout working on it. And to that end, that was successful. I did the ovals by doing the outline of each oval first using an ultrafine point Sharpie marker. I made a dot up, down, and then the corners, and then I connected those dots clockwise. And as I did the ovals, I followed a single shape pattern of making hexagons of ovals over and over again, or at least try my best to do so. A group of 6 ovals next to another group of 6 ovals, and so on. Though after a while, it sometimes ended up being a group of 6 ovals next to a group of either 5 or 7. As for me at least, even single shape patterns tend to break down a bit while into a polystyrene drawing project involving them. Perhaps most likely it has to do with maybe a lack of planning on my part. But after doing the outline of each oval, I would take a fine point marker of what I thought was one hue lighter than the ultra fine point marker I had just used. And if that turned out to not be the case, I organized the markers accordingly. I have my marker satchel organized so that most groups go from lightest to darkest hue. These groups being the skins, facials, pinks, reds, oranges, yellows, greens, teals, blues, purples, and grays. Though for this project, I ended up experimenting a lot on the pinks, skins, and facials. Here's the timestamp, the exact minute I finished the project. I used to call that the engraving years ago, before I knew you were supposed to call that a timestamp. It took a considerable amount of time to draw and color in all of those ovals. At first, I just so happened to make the color of the ovals flow into each other, or not be too abruptly different from each other by chance, and then later on I started making an effort to keep doing that. Once I had drawn and colored in all of the ovals for this project, it was then time for me to do the background, for which I ultimately had the majority of it be under a grass background, and the rest consisting of 2 water background areas. For this, I used an ultra fine point default green marker to ultimately outline the 2 areas where the water background would be for this project. For which for both tracing around the involved ovals and then coloring in between them, I used an ultra fine point default blue marker and then a fine point default blue marker respectively. I was initially going to do a dark grass against a night sky with stars background at one point during this project, which would have involved an ultra fine point and a fine point midnight blue markers. But I ultimately decided against that. Most likely because then for the grass background area, I would have had to use an ultra fine point and a fine point dark green marker. And then I wouldn't really be able to have done what I ultimately did, which was to use an ultra fine point dark green marker to do the detailing for the grass background area. And then to use an ultra fine point midnight blue marker to do the detailing for the two water background areas. For the two water background areas, I had to trace around all of the ovals covered within those two areas with an ultra fine point default blue marker, as its mark was darker than the mark of the ultra fine point markers I used to draw the outline of those ovals. Whereas for the grass background area, I didn't have to trace around those ovals and was able to essentially just do a regular coloring with a fine point default green marker around all of the ovals within that area, as the mark of that marker was only darker than some of the mark of the ultra fine point markers I used to draw those ovals. At one point, as I was working on this project, after I had finished drawing and coloring in the two water background areas, I then used the ultra fine point default blue marker again to go around the border of those two water background areas to make the borders between the two water background areas and the grass background area look as much as possible like actual grass. And I did my best to that regard, trying to make the borders look irregular. All in all, the project turned out pretty good for something I essentially did just to reorganize my marker satchel.